I noticed while I was grading the outlines that some people were having a hard time with this idea of a thesis statement and how do I write a good, compelling introduction. So I have copied and pasted into a new Word doc um, from my outline template what an introduction is, what it does, and some sentence starters to come up with a thesis statement. So an introduction, it's introducing your topic to whoever is going to be reading your paper. Usually they give like a general overview, maybe a brief history or a summary over why the topic's important. And then your introduction always ends with a thesis statement, which is like I could boil down the paper to one thought. What would it be? And so the thesis statement, I have a couple of examples here for you to kind of look at bad examples and good examples of thesis statements. So let's look at a couple of one of these. So here's one that says everyone should exercise, which is kind of vague. It doesn't really give me a good main point. It's kind of boring. You can see the person asks, why should I? What's in it for me? A good thesis statement, if you're talking about exercise or like obesity or whatever, would be Americans should add exercise to their daily morning routine because it not only keeps their bodies at a healthy weight, but also reduces the risk of high blood pressure. So here, this is more specific. So we're talking about Americans, which, has a high, like high risk. There's more risk of obesity here because of the diets we consume. Um, this says that we should add it to the morning routine, which is more specific. And then it says why to help reduce high blood pressure and stay at a healthy weight. So if you sometimes people have problems with their papers because they're too broad. If I'm specific and I'm writing about, what are the benefits or how much does it reduce my blood pressure risk, that's like an example of like a good thesis statement. Here's another one. So a bad one would be high level of alcohol consumption are bad for you. Again, this is kind of too broad. So like what risks do you want to talk about in your paper? So, for example, high levels of alcohol consumption can have detrimental effects on your personal health, such as weight gain, heart disease, and liver complications. So, if I were talking about alcohol abuse, maybe I would go in order. Maybe each of my body paragraphs would be like, okay, maybe I'm talking about in my first paragraph, how does alcohol affect weight gain? Maybe I'm talking about in the next one how it impacts my heart. And then the last one, I'll talk about liver complications. So sometimes thesis statements also lay out how you're going to organize the rest of your paper. Let's look at one more. Let's look at this one. So a bad example, all retirees should relocate to Florida. Again, why? This could like if it's too broad, you can maybe get sidetracked or it's not very convincing. Versus if I look at this good example, right? Retirees should relocate to Florida, where 75% of Americans choose to settle because you will afford yourself the opportunity to develop a wide array of friendships. So this gives me a fact. So it gives me um, important information such as 75% of Americans choose to retire to Florida, and it's giving me I'm willing to bet that this paper is going to talk about developing a wide array of friendships. Like what kind of relationship building is there in Florida? So those are just a couple of examples that I wanted to show you. So I'm going to pop back over onto this screen. I found sources over the topic of feminism. So I'm going to show you how I might go through the thought process of writing an introduction. One thing I want to point out that I noticed a couple of people doing is that they filled in all of these sentence starters. You only need one thesis statement. You don't need three. You don't need to include all three of these. This is just to help you come up with ideas in case you got stuck. So um, let's come up with an introduction together. Oops, sorry. Balancing my laptop on my lap. So if we go back to my introduction, the introduction um, introduces my topic to my reader. So maybe I want to start off and say, in the 1920s, white women constitutionally won the right to vote. However, women of color were excluded from this historical victory until the passing of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. I'm making this up, like, so don't, if you're doing feminism or if you're talking about stuff like this, I'm pulling this from the knowledge of my limited history knowledge. So don't use this. Also, I'll notice if you copied what I wrote word for word. So there's like a brief history. So in the 1920s, white women constitutionally won the right to vote. However, women of color were excluded from this historical victory until the passing of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. So there's like a general, a brief history. My first sentence is going to be just a little bit of background. Maybe I want to go on and talk about, maybe I've decided that I want my paper to focus on modern day feminism. And so maybe I'll continue and say, um, feminism is not a issue that disappeared after women gained the right to vote. Even today, the late 2010s brought about several modern feminist movements, including the #MeToo movement and the Time's Up movement. Okay, so there's like another that ties into, it leads into my focus of wanting to talk about, maybe I talk about both the history and the modern versions of feminism. So maybe I want to talk about all of the things in between, but this gives me like a good starting point for, okay, I'm thinking back in the past with my first sentence. I'm maybe interested in talking about the present in the second sentence. Let's see if I can't add something, maybe one more before I can get to my thesis statement. Maybe I want to say, women, some women still feel like there is a lot of work to be done to be considered fully equal to men. Okay. Like I said, I'm just making this up. Maybe if I had more time, I would polish this up a little bit. But okay, that sounds like a pretty solid introduction so far. I just need to add my thesis statement into it. So if I could boil my paper down into one point, maybe I would say, maybe I'm going to try this last one. Because blank occurred, blank is still of relevance today. One thing I want to note is that whatever you put in these blanks has to make sense. I saw some people just putting like random things in there and then reading it, it doesn't really make sense as a sentence. This has to make sense in order for it to work. So I can't just say because feminism occurred, women is still of relevance today. Like that doesn't make sense. The words that you put in the blanks have to mean something. So keeping that in mind, maybe I would say because mm, because the first Black Indian vice president was just elected, breaking down gender barriers is still of relevance today. So, okay. In the 1920s, white women constitutionally won the right to vote. However, women of color were excluded from this historical victory until the passing of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. Feminism is not an issue that disappeared after women gained the right to vote. The late 2010s brought about several modern feminist movements, including the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. Some women still feel like there is a lot of work to be done to be considered fully equal to men. Because the first Black Indian vice president was just elected, breaking down gender barriers is still of relevance today. So from this, I can see if I were to boil this down, I'm going to be talking, my main point is going to be about how are women in the modern times still breaking down gender barriers. So that would be what my paper is going to be about. You can see that I kind of messed with this format. Like I said, it has to make sense. So if I said because the first Black Indian vice president was just occurred, that doesn't make sense. So change these to fit how you like. I could say maybe instead, if I didn't want to go with this, I could say feminism is important because of the recent allegations against politicians, whatever, whatever is important because of blah, blah, blah. If your topic was homelessness, for example, you could say homelessness is important because people never know when they're going to be in financial hardship. Or maybe your topic was Black Lives Matter or something, and you could say, Black Lives Matter is important because blah, 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 whatever. So make sure that whatever you put here makes sense. But you could kind of see how I went through and wrote my introduction here. So you today can now kind of start crafting your own introduction, and I hope that that was helpful for you.